scientific method. I'm Alyssa Baisler, and this is my co-host, Justin Bieber. Today we will be joining two girls, Meg and Vanessa, as they experience the scientific method.
Let's go feed the ducks! Perfect! I brought bread! It's sunk. My bread's bigger, it's not scrunched up. Whoa, it floats! I wonder why my bread floats, but your bread sinks.
Step 1. Make an observation. These two girls noticed something about their environment and wondered about it.
Maybe it's because of the different densities of our bread. That must be it. Although our bread pieces were the same size originally, you balled yours up, making it more dense and compact. Now that we know that, I wonder if there's anything we could do to further extend our knowledge of bread densities.
That's a good question, Meg. We should do an experiment to test how the different kind of bread affects the bread density.
Step 2. Formulate a question. These two girls took their observations and formed it into a testable question.
Okay, now let's go to my house so we can do our experiment.
Okay.
Step 3. Create a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess as to what the outcome of the experiment will be. Meg and Vanessa formed a hypothesis as to what will happen in the experiment before they began.
What do you think will happen in the experiment, Meg?
I hypothesize that French bread will sink and be the densest, because wheat bread and white bread are usually a bit flimsier than French bread.
Step 4 is name your variables. The next step in the scientific process is to identify your variables so you can better control your experiment.
Before we start, let's name our variables.
Good idea. The manipulated variable is the variable that changes. We are going to change it from French bread to white bread to wheat bread.
The responding variable in our experiment is whether the bread floats or sinks.
And the controlled variables are things like the temperature of the water, how long we leave the bread in the water, and how much water is in the bowl.
The manipulated or independent variable is what you change in the experiment. The responding or dependent variable is what changes because of the independent variable. It is the outcome of your experiment. The controlled variable are the variables which you control. They do not change.
Now we need a plan to carry out our experiment.
I know. Let's make a procedure.
Step 5 is to formulate a procedure. A procedure is a series of numbered steps that explain how to carry out your experiment.
Let's test 3 different types of bread.
Whole grain bread,
French bread,
and white bread. First, we'll gather all materials, including bread, bowl, and water.
Step 2. Fill up a bowl of water so it has at least 3 inches of water in it.
Step 3. Take a 1 square-inch piece of whole grain bread and place it in the water for 30 seconds.
Step 4. Record any observations you notice about the whole wheat bread as it sits in the water. Make sure to notice whether it floats or sinks.
Step 5. Take the bread out of the water and repeat with 2 more trials with the whole wheat bread.
Step 6. Repeat steps 3 through 5 with the remaining 2 types of bread.
Step 7.
Put all materials away!
Step 6 is to conduct an experiment. This is where you test your question with a procedure that you have carefully written. During your experiment, make sure to measure and record your dependent and independent variables and to control your controlled variables.
Let's start our experiment by following our procedure.
Good idea. I gathered all the materials here.
I'll do step 2 by filling up this bowl with water.
And I'll start step 3 by cutting this bread into 1-inch pieces. Step 3. I've cut a 1 square-inch piece of bread and I'm going to float it in the water, which is 3 inches deep, for 30 seconds.
Tell me your observations as you see them.
Okay, the bread is below the surface of the water completely, but it's not sinking all the way to the bottom, and it looks kind of soggy.
How far below the surface do you think it is?
Just below. My timer's beeping! take the bread out. Now we can begin step 4, which is to repeat the same experiment with the same type of bread 2 more times for trials 2 and 3. Step 5, repeat the same experiment but with different types of bread. Now I'm going to do trial 1 for my French bread.
Very gross.
The French bread is at the bottom of the bowl because it sunk. It was denser than the water.
Now that we've completed 2 more trials with the French bread, we'll move on to the white bread.
The white bread floats almost completely above the surface.
I'll write that down.
Good.
Step 7, clean up all materials.
Wonderful. Step 7 is data and observations. This is where you create tables to record any data and observations that you may have collected during your experiment. Make sure to record this information in your lab journal with a pen.
Just like many other experiments, we took our data and observations during the experiment to make sure that we didn't miss any important observations.
We observed and recorded that the French bread sunk to the bottom of the bowl, the white bread floated on top, and the whole grain bread was kind of in between.
Step 8 is calculations. This is where you solve any equations needed to formulate the outcome of your experiment. Make sure to record these in a table next to your data and observations in your lab journal. Sometimes for calculations, you may need to create a graph.
This lab does not have any calculations in it, but if it did, now would be the time to do them.
Make sure that you record your calculations and equations in your lab journal. Don't just plug them into your calculator.
Step 9, conclusion. This is where you record the outcome of your experiment and state whether your hypothesis was incorrect or correct. You also summarize your data points using averages and lowest and highest data points.
This is our conclusion. In our experiment, we found that our hypothesis was true. We predicted that the French bread would sink and be the densest. We found that to be true in our experiment.
During our experiment, we first tested the grain bread. It was in the middle. It didn't fully float or sink. And then we tested the French bread. The French bread sunk all the way to the bottom in all 3 trials. Lastly, we tested the white bread. The white bread floated on the surface of the water. We can conclude that this means that the French bread was the densest, the white bread was the least dense, and the whole grain bread was kind of in the middle.
Step 10 is the analysis. This is where you look back on your experiment and state how it affects the world around you. You also state anything that could have gone wrong during your experiment that would have affected your results.
Let's analyze this information.
This lab relates to the world around us because now, when we're feeding the ducks at the pond, we'll make sure to always use white bread so that it floats on the surface so the ducks can grab it. Because if we used French bread or whole grain bread, it would sink below the surface and the ducks would be forced to dive if they wanted our bread. I wonder if anything could have gone wrong in our experiment.
Well, we didn't use a ruler to measure the pieces of bread when we cut them up, so they might not have all been the same size.
That's a good observation. I remember in the second white bread trial, I accidentally pinched the bread a little, making it thinner, and it floated to the bottom a little bit. That probably happened because it was a different thickness.
And that was one of the human experimental errors that messed up one of our trials.
And observations.
Step 11 is the extension. This is where you look back at your experiment and see how you can expand upon it and formulate more questions to further extend your knowledge.
I wonder if there's any way we can extend our knowledge.
That's a good idea. Maybe we could test different brands of French bread. Like, for example, maybe like Safeway French bread is denser than Franz French bread. And if we were using Safeway French bread, that's why it sunk. But if we used Franz French bread, it might have floated.
We could do an experiment to test it.
Yeah. The question could be something like, does brand affect the density of the bread? And then we could extend our knowledge of bread densities.
That's a good idea. It was so fun using the scientific method in real life. Let's review what we did.
First, we made an observation about the environment around us.
Then we asked a question about our observation.
Then we made a hypothesis, an educated guess, about what the answer to the question might be.
Next, we named the variables in our experiment.
Then we formulated a procedure to carry out our experiment.
Then we conducted our experiment using our procedure.
Then we took careful data and observations from the experiment.
We made a conclusion based on our experiment.
We analyzed our results.
And we created an extension to further our knowledge.
This was a really fun experiment. I hope to do it again sometime soon.
Thanks for watching today's episode of Science Daily, the scientific method. I'm Alyssa, and this is Justin, signing off. See you next week.